So my name is Sean Marble. I am the Alaska Alpine Club president, and welcome to the very first Ski Mountaineering Clinic lecture of 2021. Just a couple announcements. This is the first of hopefully a few lectures. We're working on getting a couple others planned. An avalanche lecture with hopefully Mark Oldmixon and a couple other ones. So stay tuned for info. We'll get those all planned out and we'll get the information out with hopefully a little bit more notice than this one. Yeah, that's more on the Ski Mountaineering Clinic. The way tonight is going to work is Erica is going to give her presentation. She's the other one with her video on. And then we will get to questions afterwards. And so if you have any questions during the lecture, go ahead and just post them in the chat and we'll get to them afterwards. Without further ado, I will give it on over to Erica.
Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen and then we'll give it a second to kick over. And Sean, can you give me a thumbs up when you can see that? Okay, awesome. So I don't know if I'm gonna be able to see the chat, so I might not be able to answer questions as we go, which is how I normally would like to do this. So we'll do all the questions at the end, as Sean said. But my name is Erica Lamb, and tonight I'm gonna do a little bit of an introduction to frostbite, hypothermia, and winter clothing. And normally when we do this class in person, there's a lot of like passing around layers and stuff like that. So we can't do that on Zoom. So we'll try and do this the best we can. So my name is Erica Lamb, and I've been involved with the Alaska Alpine Club for about 9 years, which is 1 year less than I've been in Fairbanks. I've been climbing rock and ice for 15 years, and I've been on skis for about 9 years. My day job is as a fluvial geomorphologist for the Bureau of Land Management. And I'll just leave my email up for a second. If you have questions later, always feel free to send me an email. And I have been fighting knee injuries for the last couple of years, so I think there's some new skiers and climbers in town, and I have not gotten to see some of you guys outside. So we're first going to talk about heat loss and sort of how we lose heat when we're outside, and then we'll talk about how we can prevent that. So there's 4 main mechanisms of heat loss. Those are radiation, conduction, convection, and evaporation. Radiation is really the major mechanism of heat loss, and that is heat transfer through infrared rays. So the same way that you feel the heat of the sun, that's radiation, you can give off heat in the same manner. It's just that it's not enough that someone else can feel it. Radiative heat loss is probably the most difficult type of heat loss to stop, but we can think about what materials we can use to stop this heat loss. We'll talk about that when we talk about layering. Conduction is the direct transfer of heat. So that is like if you're standing in water or sitting or lying down in snow, you can feel the cold being conducted to you and your heat being conducted away. And when we think about conduction, that's when we think about maybe touching really cold metal objects. The thing that people often actually don't think about with conduction, but is really critical when we talk about ski mountaineering, are fuels and alcohols, which are what people often use for like camp stoves, because those stay liquid at temperatures below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So there's actually pretty frequently people will get really bad like frostbite from liquid alcohol. The next method of heat loss is convection. So that's like moving air or water that's in contact with the skin. If we're talking about ski mountaineering, hopefully it's moving air. And we can stop this kind of heat loss by wearing windproof clothing and covering all our skin to minimize convective heat loss and reduce the chance of frostbite. So we really feel convective heat loss if it's super, super windy. And then the final way we lose heat is evaporation. And that's the physical change of liquid to water vapor, and that extracts heat in that process. So it's typically through breathing or through sweat evaporating off the body. And really the biggest way that we can limit evaporation or evaporative heat loss is by not sweating that much, and then also by wearing vapor barriers. And I'll talk about vapor barriers because that's often a new concept for people in a little bit. So before we talk about how can we prevent some of these things, we really want to first talk about how do we stay dry, because that's one of the easiest ways to stay warm in the backcountry. So the first thing is we don't want to sweat. And we don't want to sweat by limiting how many warm clothing we're wearing, so maybe layering, so we can always take off a layer. We want to dry in small amounts, and that is often where wearing like a puffy jacket actually comes in. We want to avoid excess moisture from the environment. So that's if you're out with people that are really experienced in the backcountry, you'll see that they're often really careful about keeping their gloves dry, keeping snow out of their boots. And then really we want to go back to the easiest way to stay dry is to don't sweat. And we can make sure that we're not sweating by really layering appropriately for the environment that we're in and the activity that we're doing. So sort of the like overview of layering is that we typically want to wear a wicking base layer so that we're moving any sweat that we do produce away from our skin. So if you remember, evaporation leads to heat loss through that transition from liquid water to water vapor. So we want to wear a wicking base layer, so we're moving that water away from our skin. We want to wear the lightest and quickest drying clothing that is appropriate to the environment that we're in. So that's going to be a pretty different set of clothes for if you're going ice climbing in Valdez and it's 31 degrees and snowing, versus if you're in the deltas and it's pretty cold. We want to wear the most breathable layers that are suitable for the conditions. We want to use a puffy coat to dry layers, and then we really want to make sure that we keep our boots dry, because a puffy jacket is not going to help us dry our boots out. So one thing that I want to talk about now is shell layers, because that's often something that comes up for people is like, what shell should I wear? We're going to work from the outside in now. So we'll talk about shells and then we'll talk about base layers. So there's sort of two main types of shells that we think about for both jackets and pants, and those are soft shells and hard shells. So soft shells are like sort of the shoulder or polar type fabrics. And the advantages of that are that they tend to be really breathable, pretty durable, and they feel good. They tend to be a little bit more pliable, and they don't necessarily like get really weird and crunchy in the cold. The disadvantages of soft shells, and some of these disadvantages are really being changed with new fabrics or layers that combine fabrics, but the typical disadvantages of soft shells are that they absorb water, they can be a little bit heavy, they can be really slow to dry if they do get wet, and they're not waterproof. So you wouldn't want to wear these, again, if you're in like Southeast Alaska where it's pretty warm and snowing. Membrane hard shells are like the Gore-Tex, H2No, conduit fabrics. And the big advantage of those are that they're waterproof and they dry super quickly. The disadvantages are that they typically are not super breathable, and the breathability of those layers actually really is decreased in cold weather. They can get pretty crunchy feeling too, and if they're really wet, they can actually like freeze into a shape. So that is where you can see people that are like frozen into a particular shape. They may have a membrane hard shell that was wet and then immediately froze. And then the third kind of jacket that I want to talk about, and I'm saying jacket for this one is because it's very rare to have people wearing pants of these layers, are the microfiber nylons. And those are like the Houdini jacket or the Alpine Light. And the advantages of these are that they're super ultra light. They tend to be really quick drying and be pretty breathable. The disadvantages are that they're definitely not storm-proof. They're often like water resistant, but not waterproof. And they're really not durable, which is why most people don't wear these types of layers for things like skiing or mountaineering. And they don't tend to be very warm or have a whole lot of features. So soft shells and hard shells are where you're likely to have like options of where do you want pockets, and do you want it to be a kind of jacket that can integrate with your pants. The microfiber nylon jackets are not going to have those features. So that's our shell, and now I want to talk about base layers. And the two big types of base layers are synthetic base layers and wool or merino base layers. So synthetic base layers are like polypropylene, so polypro or polyester. And those are fabrics that don't really absorb water, so they tend to not get wet. If they do get wet, they will still insulate and they tend to dry really quickly. And normally, if we're in person, I can ask who has shared a tent with someone who's wearing polypro for multiple days on end, and everyone will laugh because we know that it smells terrible after it's been sweated in a whole bunch. And then these fibers also tend to have a lot of evaporative cooling because they transport moisture really fast. So they can actually make that evaporation feel a little bit stronger. So you'll feel the evaporative heat loss more. Wool base layers, so merino, absorb about 30% of their weight of water into the core of the fabric. So the water is not actually on the surface of the fiber, it's in the middle, so they tend not to feel quite as wet on your body, and they'll feel warmer when they're wet. On the other hand, wool can be heavier and slower to dry, but your tent mates might prefer it. And there's a lot of actually newer fabrics that are like incorporate both synthetic and wool properties, or are actually a mix of synthetic and wool. So for our body, we have maybe like a base layer that's synthetic or wool, and then potentially a mid-layer insulation. And then our shell, what about is on our head? So if I'm going ski mountaineering, I usually have a balaclava and a hat, and at least one of those is going to be windproof. And to add to that, I usually have like 4 or 5 hoods, depending on how many layers I'm wearing and how many of those have hoods. But your face mask or face protection is really critical in windy weather, because that's where we tend to see the convective cooling and you become susceptible to frostbite, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And so if you have a balaclava on and a hat on, you still have parts of your face that tend to be exposed. And that's where wearing something like ski goggles can protect your eyes, which actually can become susceptible, and other exposed parts of the face. And the really critical thing if you're going ski mountaineering or climbing is that these layers really have to fit under your helmet. And then maybe the layer that's your outermost layer, so your shell, the hood on that would fit over your helmet. So one thing that people always tend to talk about or ask about is how do they keep their hands warm? And the way that I do that is actually by layering my hands. So I'll wear liner gloves, and you can get liner gloves in synthetic and in wool. And I'll have a bunch of different pairs of liner gloves so that I can keep them dry. And then I'll have some thicker gloves that maybe go over my liner gloves, a mitten, which is sort of like your hands version of a puffy jacket. And then sort of thinking about, what am I doing? Am I going ice climbing or am I going ski mountaineering? Because you might need more dexterity for some of those activities, or even certain parts of those activities. So if I'm going ice climbing, I might wear a thicker layer when I'm belaying, or if I'm skiing on my hands. So that's when I'll wear my mittens, but I'll change into my gloves if I'm actually doing climbing. And the other place that we really tend to have issues with layering are on our feet. So most people I think have heard the phrase cotton kills, which is a fairly old saying. And the reason that people say that is because cotton really doesn't hold any insulative value when it gets wet. And it's really hard to stop our feet often from sweating. So we can layer up and down on the rest of our body, but our feet are sort of, once we've committed to a foot layering system, we're sort of stuck with that for the day. So for most people, that's going to be potentially a liner sock and then wool socks. We really want to make sure too we're wearing appropriate footwear. So boots or over boots or double boots, depending on what the conditions are. And then maybe vapor barriers if necessary, and gaiters and over boots. And I'm just going to take a quick pause and try and mute a couple people who I think are maybe making some noise out there. Okay. So vapor barriers are often something that's a pretty new like technique or a new layering system. So we'll talk about those a little bit more. So vapor barriers at their simplest and cheapest form are essentially a bread bag. So I use those. So what I'll do for vapor barriers is I'm wearing a really thin polypro, so synthetic sock liner. I put my vapor barrier, i.e. my plastic bag over that, and then my wool sock goes over the plastic bag. And the advantage of doing it like this is that moisture is prevented from getting into the insulation. So there's no moisture going into my wool sock or into my insulation in my boot because it's all trapped in the plastic bag and then in my synthetic liner sock. So they prevent evaporative heat loss. And you don't have to use these just on your feet, like you can use them as a full body system. So people will often use vapor barriers in their sleeping bag. So it's essentially a person-sized version of a bread bag. And when you sleep, you often are emitting a little bit of moisture. Maybe you're sweating or your clothes are wet, and that moisture can then get into the down sleeping bag. So a sleeping bag vapor barrier can make your down sleeping system function for a long time in cold temperatures by really keeping that moisture out of the insulation of your sleeping bag. The big advantage too that people find for vapor barriers if they're using them on their feet is that they can reduce the friction in boots and therefore reduce blisters. There are some disadvantages to vapor barriers. One is they essentially can cause trench foot if you're not properly drying your feet every day, because any moisture that comes out of your foot, so any sweat, is trapped in your boot on your foot. They can feel really wet and slimy, and if you're using them in warmer temperatures, they can cause overheating. So for some people, that can lead to something like heat rash on your feet. They tend to smell really bad because, again, all your sweat is trapped in on your foot. And if you're using a vapor barrier sleeping system, it can make it harder to dry your socks or your hats, because a lot of times what people will do if they're winter camping or mountaineering is wet layers at the end of the day will go into their sleeping bag with them, because the heat of the body will help force some of that moisture out, and that moisture will then end up in the sleeping bag. But that doesn't really work as well if you're using a full body sleeping bag vapor barrier. So what works for me? I'm underlining me because we'll kind of like run through this list of how do you decide what would work for you, and then I'll talk about what works for me personally. So sort of the things to think about are like, what do you own? What can you borrow? What is your budget? What are you doing and what time of year is it, and where are you doing it? Are you in the interior, in high elevations, or are you going to be in Southeast Alaska? Do you sweat a lot? Do you get really cold hands and feet? Do you want a vapor barrier system, and to deal with those disadvantages as well as the advantages of a vapor barrier system? So for me, and this is again what my system is, and I'm really going to try and sort of talk generally about what I usually do, because I don't want to say that there's any one brand or any one type of some of these layers that works better. So I usually wear a wool base layer if it's colder or I expect to be doing a lot of starting and stopping. And I'll wear a synthetic base layer if it's like a higher output activity. And I really want to recognize that getting into outdoor activities can be really cost prohibitive. But one of my favorite base layers that I wore every day last winter is a 100% merino wool base layer from Costco, and I think it was like $12. So you don't always need the brand name of some of these things. So I usually do a base layer, and then I tend to run a little bit cold. So I usually have a mid-weight synthetic layer over that, which is maybe something like a Patagonia R1 or something that's a little bit fleecy. And then the other one, if it's really cold in interior Alaska, is you'll see people wearing these like nano puffs. So they look like really thin little synthetic shells or like synthetic jackets. And then I wear a soft shell or a Gore-Tex depending on the trip. So how much wind do I think there's going to be? How much water do I think there's going to be? What do I expect to be doing? So I'll actually sometimes do like a Gore-Tex pants and a soft shell jacket if I think maybe I'm going to kneel in the snow a lot. So I'm going ski touring and I'm going to dig some snow pits. I'm going to kneel in the snow and I think the snow might be wet. Maybe I'm going to wear Gore-Tex pants, but I don't think my top is going to get wet, so I can wear a soft shell jacket. I always bring puffy pants and jacket, no matter if I'm doing a short day trip or a super long trip, I always have my puffy pants, my puffy jacket with me. I almost always do vapor barrier socks because that tends to really work well for me. I don't tend to have the issues with my feet getting overly sweaty or having heat rash unless it's super warm, like above freezing. I usually bring multiple pairs of dry liner gloves, but only one pair of like warmer gloves and then a pair of mittens. And I always wear like a neck warmer or buff. And again, I just want to point out what works for some people and what people try to sell you on maybe doesn't work for you. So I'm pretty short and maybe I'm going to end up needing to wear something different than these guys that are like 10 feet taller than me. So it's worth, just because something worked for other people doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work for you. So now that we talked a little bit about layering, let's talk about what happens if we get our layering wrong or we're in conditions that are worse than we expected. So hypothermia can be defined in a couple different ways. Mild hypothermia is a core body temperature between 90 and 95 degrees Fahrenheit. And just if anyone is new to the Fahrenheit system, the average temperature we typically say is 98.6. People tend to run a little bit around that, so like 97 to maybe 99. Moderate hypothermia is a temperature between 86 and 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and severe hypothermia is if your core body temperature is less than 86 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's so much easier to prevent hypothermia than it is to treat it. And thinking warm thoughts is not enough. So if you're going out with people and it seems like you're starting to feel cold, just sort of like standing around not doing anything isn't going to help you feel warmer. And we really want to be able to enjoy the mountains, and we can't do that if we're cold. So we want to make sure that we're preventing hypothermia. So how do we do that? The first way is by being comfortably cool. And that means often starting cold. So that means you're leaving the car or leaving your tent and you're like, wow, I really think I could maybe have one more layer on. You don't put it on right away because you want to make sure that you're not getting all sweaty. And really, we're not, for the most part, we're not out there with like electric heaters unless you're someone who uses like electric socks or electric insoles or maybe electric gloves. So if you think of really like you are the heater, that means you have to fuel your own heater, fuel the fire. So that means staying hydrated and eating. And I put this really bad picture of myself in here because every photo I have where I'm sort of like at rest in the mountains, I am almost always have a whole bunch of food shoved into my mouth. And just like what works for one person layering doesn't work for everyone, the same goes for food. So we all kind of need the same thing in the mountains, which is like high energy food that doesn't freeze and won't break our teeth. But what that food is really depends on the person. So for some people, that's going to be things like cheese and maybe like cured meat products. I tend to carry a lot of gummy bears and Swedish fish, as well as sometimes some bars. So really figuring out like what's your favorite food that you can still eat when it's really cold and it won't freeze, and how much food do you need? And then the other thing that I really think it's important to sort of like consider or like just be aware of is how often do you have to eat? Some people can eat just like a few times and a whole bunch of food, and other people need to be eating constantly. And staying hydrated is, again, super important. If we're dehydrated, we tend to be colder. Maybe our extremities get colder faster. So being outside in the cold, it often means we are keeping our water insulated in like insulated koozies and a Nalgene. We're storing our Nalgenes upside down so that the lids don't get frozen on. If I'm going out for just a day, I'll usually carry like hot tea. But really making sure that you're also carrying your water in a way where you can easily get to it. So mild hypothermia is probably the most important thing to recognize, because if you can recognize mild hypothermia, that means you can probably treat it from becoming moderate or severe hypothermia. So mild hypothermia is often thought of as the umbles, as the stumbles, the mumbles, the bumbles. Someone is like bumbling around. They're starting to not make as much sense because they're not enunciating super clearly. The person with mild hypothermia probably says, I'm feeling cold, but maybe doesn't do anything about it. So the way that we want to warm this person back up is we want to get them to rewarm themselves. And the saying for that is we want to feed them and beat them. This is probably an old saying that maybe we can revise in 2021, but that means this person is someone you want to make sure you get food into them, and maybe that's something sugary. So I might give you a couple of my gummy bears. I want to give you some hot water, and then I'm going to make you move around because we really want to get that internal heater going so that you can rewarm yourself. Severe hypothermia tends to have a really different set of signs than mild hypothermia. Someone with super severe hypothermia actually doesn't shiver anymore. They typically will have pretty impaired mental function and really deteriorated muscle function. So they will have gone from sort of being like stumbly and bumbly to potentially not moving around by themselves at all. They may have periods of like total unresponsiveness with periods of activity. They often won't make any sense if they can talk, and they may have a little bit of a loss of vision. And the signs of profound hypothermia are sort of the signs that you're not going to find on someone you're on a rope team with. So this is not someone who it's cold out and you're like moving and they're like, oh, I'm cold. This is someone that is maybe you go find outside, or if you're at like a popular campsite. So like, you know, if you're in the mountains and there's a bunch of people on the same mountain, this is maybe someone who you find at one of those camps. It's not someone that's like moving with you on a rope team. So the treatment of profound hypothermia is a medical emergency. Often like cold and toxic blood has pooled in this person's extremities. And so we really want to avoid rough handling, physical exertion, and we actually want to avoid rapid rewarming. And rewarming is pretty risky, and so typically this is why we're saying it's a medical emergency, and you really want to have someone with more medical training involved. So that is hypothermia, which is where the core body temperature drops. And then the thing that is typically more commonly seen is like frostbite, which is where we see damage to often extremities, but really any exposed skin. So people will often talk about frost nip or frostbite on their cheeks, fingers, toes, ears, noses are kind of the places that we see this more often. Frost nip is more minor, it's pretty common, and the underlying tissue doesn't get totally frozen. So frost nip is a warning that you need to cover that body part up and really think about warming up the body. So frost nip is on this picture, you can see there's like some white, and that's to indicate the frozen tissue is pretty superficial. Then when we go to frostbite, it's deeper, and the skin will go from being kind of just pale to being white, and the underlying tissue is really frozen and stiff. So if you had frostbite on your cheeks, it would feel really stiff if you touched your cheeks. And frostbite is the deeper tissues are being harmed. So frost nip is damage to the superficial cell layer, and frostbite is really talking about deeper tissues. And frostbite is what will result in blisters and black skin after rewarming. And there's, a couple of causes of both frost nip and frostbite, and those are hypothermia, but it's more often like wind chill, so the exposed body part, and vasoconstriction. So if blood flow was reduced to a body part, maybe because of a really tight ring on a finger or tight clothing. And this is where we also want to think a little bit about our hydration levels, because if we're dehydrated, we're probably not having quite as good blood flow to some of those extremities. So again, frostbite, if it's pale, it's superficial, and if it's purple, it's much deeper. If the skin just looks kind of waxy, we're probably talking about frost nip. But if you touch it and it's really hard and firm, it's frostbite. And if a body part that was frostbitten thaws out, that's where we see the discoloration or blisters. And if you're squeamish, I'm going to give you a second now to look away from your computer screen, because now we will look at a picture of frostbite. And so we know that this is frostbite, not frost nip, because there's the really deep purple color and the blistering. And one more picture. This is, again, frostbite. We see the blistering. And the big concern here is if everyone looks, it's her right hand has a ring on it. And we often worry about like things like rings with frostbite because there's often swelling. And so that ring maybe had some vasoconstriction in the first place. And then with swelling, it may get stuck on and sort of increase some of the damage that can happen to that finger. So if you're a ring wearer, it's worth thinking about, do you need to wear a metal ring in the backcountry? For a wide variety of reasons, frostbite is one of them. So the textbook treatment of frostbite is going to be to keep the body part that is frostbitten frozen and head to the emergency room. That is not always possible if we're in the backcountry, but it's really worth thinking about if someone has frostbite, not frostnet, frostbite, what is the best course of action? And it's not always to warm the body part up, because once that frostbitten body part has gotten warmed up, that's when we start to see the blistering. If it's someone's feet, they can't walk on thawed feet, it's gonna be super painful. And we really want to rewarm only if there's no chance of refreezing. So we don't want to, if you have frostbite on your hand, you don't want to warm it back up if you have a really long ski out where you risk refreezing it. I think the best analogy is that if you have like food in your freezer and you salmon in your freezer and you thaw it, you really don't want to refreeze it. It's not going to be very good when you thaw it out for the second time. And so if frostbite, you determine that it does need to be rewarmed and there's no chance of refreezing, it has to be done correctly. And again, further training is needed. But it is worth considering giving the person aspirin or ibuprofen to help increase circulation and decrease the pain a little bit. So frostbite after rewarming. Again, you want to keep the person warm. The tissue cannot be allowed to refreeze. You want to elevate the injured tissue and really carefully protect it from trauma or irritation, because that's, you're often going to see the blistering, so swelling. You want to protect toes and fingers with like gauze or cotton, keep blisters intact, provide emotional support, and evacuate that person as soon as possible. So the moral of this story is that we really want to travel smart and we don't want to let frostbite or hypothermia happen to you. And that means we are dressing appropriately and wearing lots of layers. We're being prepared for changes in the weather. We're eating regularly and staying hydrated, and we are preventing mild hypothermia from becoming severe. And that's all I have. So we're gonna open this up to questions now. And I think I'm gonna allow people to unmute themselves if I can. So does anyone have any questions? It doesn't look like we've got any in the chat right now.
Yeah, I guess more of a comment. My name's Sawyer Huffman. I saw that you were talking about vapor barriers. I never thought of the bread, the bread idea. Have you ever used anything else? Because it's currently all I use is like either like bags from Walmart, and those are kind of uncomfortable in my shoe.
Yeah, so I have used like actual vapor barriers. Like I bought a pair of vapor barriers. I've used like Fred Meyer bags, and then the grocery bags tend to be pretty thin, and so they actually tend to rip. So I feel like I need to carry multiple pairs. And the ones that I got, I wore, they were fantastic, but there's honestly, I wouldn't buy them again. I sort of wore them out and have been happy with the bread bags ever since. And the bread bags tend to be thick enough that for me at least, they'll last for like a whole trip.
Sweet. Yeah, that's good to know, because I saw that Rab makes a vapor barrier sock, but like $40 for a pair of socks that I'm going to wear out in a week just seems excessive.
Yeah, and I had a different brand and they lasted probably like 2 or 3 seasons, but they often have like a little bit of a coating to make them like extra waterproof, and that coating is what wore off on them actually.
Sweet, thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Here's a comment from Zach Torville. He uses big trash bags and he cuts the tops off.
Yeah, that's another awesome idea, particularly if bread bags don't fit your foot very well.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
You said that you always bring puffy pants. Is that for if you have to belay or if you're bivouacking, or like where your situation where you might be standing still?
So I bring them both as something that I sort of count in part of my like layering system, and I also bring them as just like a sort of general emergency layer. So I've got puffy pants that have like a zipper on the side, so I can put them on and off with crampons on or ski boots, so I don't have to take my boots off. And they're pretty big, so they're like a size bigger than I would maybe normally buy. And so if I'm going ice climbing, I will often put them on at the belays if it's pretty cold out. And if I'm like mountaineering, I'll put them on at camp if you're like sort of starting to slow things down, or like if you're cooking outside, so you're not in your sleeping bag, then I'll put my puffy pants on. But having been injured in the backcountry, I will also say that I was really happy to have had puffy pants for if you're ever just in a situation where you're out longer than you expected to be.
Thank you.
Anyone else have any questions or any tips that they want to share for how they layer in the Alaska winter?
Go ahead. So I'll speak. I was going to mention one strategy that I like to use is grabbing a selection of layers and bringing them down to the trailhead and not regretting it, because it's hard to read the forecast and decide what layer it's going to be. But if you open the car door and you get hit in the face with some wind, that's usually a good indication of what sort of layers you want. So bring more with you to the trailhead than you think you're going to use.
Yeah, that's an awesome tip. Thanks, Nick.
I'm curious what your thoughts are on removing the intuition liners from the boots, because I've like started doing that, and I've noticed that like maybe my intuition liners now are not fitting as nice, and like taking them constantly in and out of the ski boot is not good for them. I'm just curious like what your thoughts are on that.
So I maybe I'm not one to talk. I take mine out a lot, and I actually maybe I shouldn't admit this. I use the same set of intuition liners in multiple pairs of boots. So they are maybe no longer perfect, but you actually can heat mold intuition liners a little bit, most of them. So if you've been taking them in and out a lot, you can mold them back so they fit better. But particularly if I'm winter camping, that intuition liner is, so intuition is a name brand for like the liner that you will have in like backcountry ski boots, where the whole liner can come out, or in double plastic or mountaineering boots. So that is the like insulation layer of those boots. And so especially if you haven't been wearing a vapor barrier, that insulation can get a little bit wet during the day. And so I would absolutely, if I weren't wearing a vapor barrier foot system, I would take that liner into my sleeping bag with me. But I usually wear them in my sleeping bag either way because my feet tend to be cold. I'm not sure if that answered the question at all.
Yeah. And also, do you heat mold them yourself, or do you like take them to REI to get heat molded?
I have done both. Some of them are like really heat moldable, and then some of them you can like put in your oven at a pretty low temperature just to get a little bit of if there's like a spot that's really bothering you. But I don't want to say do them in your oven and then I don't want to. Yeah.
I have a comment on that.
I'm not responsible if you go that route, but
So I have done the heat molding at home, and it involves like stuffing a sock full of rice and microwaving it, and it's pretty difficult. So if you're like well set up to do it, you might consider trying it, but I would almost recommend taking it to REI and having it done because it's just so much simpler.
And a lot of the heat moldable linings will sort of mold to your foot just through like the heat from your foot if you wear them a lot. So if you end up not getting something heat molded, they'll sort of get there eventually, but the heat molding is a way to get there sooner or really address if there's a specific hot spot or you have a lot of pressure in a specific part of the boot.
Sweet, thank you. Yeah, and I guess my final question is the whole trying to keep your Nalgene water bottles from freezing. I never thought about turning them upside down, but do you guys do anything creative when you're like trying to create like a little thermos for them or anything?
So I often have them in like I think in Fairbanks it's pretty common for people to use the 40 below covers, and I might have one easily accessible, but they're like a thick neoprene sleeve. And so that's what I usually use. And so I usually will often keep one really easily accessible. And sometimes that's like on the hip belt of my backpack or on the straps where I can really easily reach it. And I'll have that water bottle upside down so that if it does freeze, it's at the bottom and not at the lid. And then if I'm carrying another one, sometimes I'll keep that wrapped up in my puffy jacket. So then it's staying warm and I'm not usually moving with my puffy jacket on. And then for like shorter trips, I often have some luck with using like noon tablets or electrolyte tablets that'll sort of like drop the freezing temperature down just a little bit. But I usually start with boiling water in your bottle, so you want to make sure you're using like a BPA free bottle.
Sweet, thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Not really a question, Erica, but maybe you could elaborate on what you wear when you're going to bed at night and what layers you keep on and which ones you stuff in the bag and things like that.
Yeah, so to be honest, I don't know if I've ever been on a trip almost where I'm like, man, I brought too many layers to sleep in. So I often sleep in essentially everything that I have with me. And sometimes that includes my puffy pants and puffy jacket. But if I have a warm enough bag where I don't maybe need that, the puffy jacket will put like over me. I guess thinking about like sleeping systems, that's where I tend not to use a vapor barrier sleeping system, in part because I'm typically doing shorter trips. So if it's just like 1 to 3 nights, I'm not quite as worried about the moisture getting into the down of my sleeping bag. But you do want to make sure that when you're tightening the hood of your bag up, that you're not breathing into your bag, because that's a lot of moisture that you're inputting into the insulation rather than sort of into your tent wall. But so I'm wearing probably most or all of my clothes. And then if I often have like a dry pair of socks to sleep in. So I have those on, and then I had the socks that I was wearing during the day, my liner gloves and some of my electronics in with my bag with me, along with my boot liners. And that is often why you'll hear that people say that they buy like a little bit of a bigger winter sleeping bag than a summer bag, is because they're going to have all these other things in the bag with them. And I will often have a hot water bottle in my bag with me too. The danger with that is obviously that if the bottle leaks, all that water will be into your bag. So you'll really want to make sure that that's tightened extra securely.
Awesome, thanks.
I have a question for you, Erica. What is your
Yeah.
favorite layer of all time?
Ooh, I think it's probably Patagonia R1. I think that's probably my most used layer. And that's sort of like thin waffly fleece. I will, if it's pretty cold, I'll wear it like over my base layer, and then even potentially under like a synthetic insulation mid layer. And if it's, you know, warm, like I'm doing spring skiing, I'll wear my R1 with maybe just like a little like Houdini type shell over it. But that's by far my most used layer. Looks like other people in the comments are saying that's a popular option for them as well.
Another question: how often do you use a Houdini or nylon synthetic layer? Do you feel like you get sweatier when you're wearing it, and so when you're doing high output activity, usually you're not wearing something like that?
So I actually, and maybe this is, I might just be a little, I do the opposite, but I actually tend to wear a wool layer if I'm doing a lot of starting and stopping. So if I'm going like ice climbing or mountaineering, where I think that maybe we're gonna like be moving slower, I'll often wear a wool layer. But if I'm doing a high output activity where I expect to be moving pretty constantly, I'll tend to veer more towards synthetic. And in part, that's because the synthetics are typically a little bit better about wicking that moisture just away from directly next to your skin. And so for like higher output activities where I think I might be generating more sweat, I typically end up feeling a little less clammy in a synthetic layer versus a wool layer.
Thank you.
I have another question. What's your go-to breakfast in the morning? Or are you one of those mountaineers that just doesn't eat breakfast?
Well, you could ask Nick about not eating breakfast. I am a breakfast person. So a lot of, obviously like instant oatmeal is pretty popular. And I'm not a huge oatmeal fan. I actually really like doing instant mashed potatoes for breakfast. And so I'll often do instant mashed potatoes. And then if it's a trip that's like where I want more calories or it's colder, I'll add things into that. So maybe a little cheese for extra fat, or even like olive oil or something.
Yummy.
Does anyone else have any questions or comments to add? Well, thank you all for joining us. This is definitely a different way of us doing the ski mountaineering class. You know, we're not able to be as interactive as we would be in person, but it's cool since we get to, people can come and join for pieces, and we can have more people do the class. So if you have any suggestions for how we could do this better, definitely feel free to send those to the alaskaalpineclub@gmail.com. And I'll stick around now too if people have more questions or anything like that. I don't know, Sean, if you have anything else you want to add?
Yeah, thank you so much, Erica.
Mm-hmm.
When I sent out the invite for the lecture, I said there were some recommended readings and some videos to watch on our website. If you haven't done that yet and would still like to do so, that is still on our website. Just go to our website and go to Introduction to Ski Mountaineering Clinic, and we're gonna be adding more resources there as well going forward. So thank you very much for coming tonight.
And Sean, can you remind us what the next lecture is in the series?
Yeah, we're still working on putting together a lineup for the rest of the semester, but so far I've talked with Mark Oldmixon about giving an avalanche discussion or an avalanche safety discussion on the, I believe it's the 25th of March. And so we're going to get some information out about that, and we hope to see you all there.
I can probably sneak one in before that too, so that we're not doing it once a month. Take your lecture or something.
Even better. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I'll go ahead and post this recording on the website so that you can refer back to it.